for the second time this week, there have been explosions in Crimea. It's not yet clear who is responsible for them. There were explosions at a Russian military base there. A separate fire also broke out at a power substation, and a railway was also damaged. Now, Crimea has a Russian-appointed local governor. He spoke after the explosion happened.
As of now, the information we have is that 2 people were injured. One man was hit by a shrapnel fragment. The other wounded person was buried under a wall. I've ordered a 5-kilometre zone to be closed off. The evacuation of all civilians from within this 5-kilometre zone is underway.
Now, a week ago, there were a series of explosions at an airfield, and it's reported they destroyed at least 7 Russian aircraft. Now, let's remind ourselves why Crimea is important. Russia illegally invaded it in 2014 and has occupied it ever since. And since Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, its forces now also control all those areas that you see there in red. And the fact these strikes are hitting military bases in Crimea is significant. The defence editor at The Economist, Dzhankoi, explains why.
It forces Russia to push its ammunition depots and command posts further away from the front lines. And that has both a sort of demoralizing value, but it actually also has a logistical value because it makes life more difficult for Russia to get all those that ammunition, to get those weapons from those depots all the way to the front lines.
Well, Russian officials initially said it happened because of a fire. Now instead they've said this.
We are now seeing an official statement from the Ministry of Defense that today's emergency was caused by sabotage.
So Russia blames sabotage, but Ukraine hasn't said it is responsible. Here's one military expert's view on what both sides are saying.
It is possible that it was an accident. It is possible it's sabotage. It is possible that it was a long-range attack. We really don't know. Russia wants it to be ambiguous because they don't want to admit that they're vulnerable. And Ukraine wants it to be ambiguous to keep the Russians guessing. So I think both sides would rather have no clear answer.
Crimea is important for both Ukraine and Russia. Let's take a run through why. It's recognised internationally as part of Ukraine. Then, in 2014, Russia invaded and held a referendum on it joining Russia. The international community sees that referendum as illegal. Since then, the Russian government has poured billions into the area and built a bridge to connect Crimea to the Russian mainland. Now, many Ukrainians see the annexation as the beginning of the war with Russia. And last week, the Ukrainian president said the war in Ukraine must end with Crimea's liberation. For Russia, Crimea is a military stronghold. It also has psychological importance. Let's hear from Andrew McLeod again.
That's why these attacks are so important, because the Ukrainians, if they are doing these attacks, are saying to the Russians, if you think you can retreat to the Crimean Peninsula for a bit of R&R, we're going to keep you guessing a bit.
It's not the only news out of Ukraine today. Let's take a look. This is a satellite image of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Now, it was captured by Russian forces in early March, you might remember, and has since remained under their control. The Ukrainian workers are still in their jobs. Both sides have accused the other of shelling areas that are nearby. Ukraine says Moscow has hidden ammunition at the site, effectively holding it hostage. International nuclear inspectors are trying to reach the plant, but haven't been able to do so yet. They need permission to access from both Russia and Ukraine. And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he spoke last night and he had this warning.
If now the world lacks the strength and determination to protect one nuclear plant, it means the world will lose. It loses to terrorists. It is yielding to nuclear blackmail. And this may be a precedent that other terrorists will see.
Well, to unpack all of this, I'm joined by Professor Serhiy Kudelia. He's a political scientist at Baylor University in Texas. You're very welcome to Outside Source. I suppose one thing, we hear it was an act of sabotage, what happened last night, according to Russia. What do you think they mean? What is an act of sabotage?
Well, what the Russians are saying is that it basically is an intelligence failure. They are trying to blame some Ukrainian underground forces, Ukrainian guerrillas, partisans, who are operating in Crimea and supposedly attacked this particular ammunition storage site. They are trying to dismiss the possibility of direct rocket attacks from Ukrainian territory, because that would actually mean a military failure on the Russian part. But I would say it is very important that Russia finally recognized that Ukrainians can represent a direct threat to Crimea, and that Ukrainian military forces and armed forces can actually operate on the Crimean territory. Because Crimea has a tremendous symbolic significance for Russia. For the last 8 years, it has been off limits for the Ukrainian troops. There were no attempts of attacking Crimea on the part of the Ukrainian forces. But after a series of political statements coming from the Ukrainian leadership, emphasizing the importance of liberating of Crimea, we suddenly have seen a demonstration of the capacity of Ukraine to actually engage directly the Russian forces that are stationed in Crimea. So I think it certainly sends a very important signal to the people who live in Crimea that the possibility of an escalation that can reach Crimea is quite possible in the near future.
But there's so many questions that come to me as I listen to you, Sergei. And one is why, because the Ukrainians have not claimed responsibility for this, why do you think that might be, if they in fact have carried it out?
Well, as I said, for the last 8 years, Crimea has been off limits, and Ukraine avoided direct attacks on the Crimean territory. So if Ukraine directly recognizes its responsibility for these attacks, it would mean a major shift in the tactics that Ukraine is using, and an escalation of sorts in the current Russian-Ukrainian war. But certainly, between the lines, if you read the tweets that are coming out of Zelensky's office, if you are looking at some of the hints that high-ranking officials are making, there is very little doubt that, in fact, Ukraine is responsible for these patterns of explosions that happened over the last several days.
And do you think it makes a difference? Because we talk about off-limits or escalation of this conflict. Does it make a difference that the attacks are taking place in Crimea instead of the Russian mainland?
Well, as I said, it certainly makes a huge difference, because Crimea has been sold by Putin to the Russian public as this demonstration of Russia's restoration to the great power status. And if suddenly you see that Crimea cannot be properly protected, that even the military sites, such an important military sites as the airfield, for example, can be attacked by the Ukrainians, then the entire peninsula is vulnerable, and Russia is basically humiliated, because for the last 8 years they failed to create sufficient protections for even the defense installations there, let alone other infrastructural objects.
Interesting. May I get your thoughts as well just on the other story that's coming out of Ukraine today, and that was about Mr. Zelensky calling for sanctions on Russia when it comes to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Do you think new sanctions would make a difference for the safety or security of that area?
Well, we certainly see that sanctions have only a long-term effect. So we should not expect an immediate positive effect of sanctions on the resolution of this particular crisis. But this crisis indeed is very important. And the claims that Russians have been making that it was Ukrainians who were targeting the power plant, of course, make no sense to anyone who can look at the map and see that the contamination that can result from these artillery attacks would actually damage a huge number, a large amount of Ukrainian territory. So it certainly requires an immediate action on the part of the international community, and sanctions is only part of the entire effort.
Professor, thanks so much for spending some time with us here on Outside Source and giving us your analysis.
Thank you.